If you're a sim racer but the words brake bias don't mean anything to you, don't click off this video. Today you will learn something that will actually help you. For this is one of the most important, useful and eye-opening things I can ever possibly teach you in sim racing, especially if you're new and struggling to make progress. If you know how to use brake bias, you can give your car extra stability, extra turning power and extra stopping power at the flick of a switch, anytime, even as you drive. It's not difficult to learn either, trust me. Understanding brake bias is as simple as putting the right amount of milk in your tea, and making the small effort to use it will give you an advantage over those who don't, and it will help you build confidence and race results in basically any racing simulator, including iracing, ACC, Gran Turismo and so on. Let me show you how. Before we crack on, a quick plug. Use the discount code DannyLee to get 5% off everything at Race Anywhere, a UK-based sim racing hardware shop that also ships globally, with a specially selected and up-to-date range of equipment in their store, buying advice and guidance, a build and collect service, and you can even visit their site in the Midlands to try a high-end demo setup for yourself before you buy. Check the video description for more information, and thanks for taking the time to look. Whenever you press the brake in your virtual race car, whether just a little bit or a lot, that braking force is portioned out or split between the front and rear wheels. This is not usually a straight 50-50 divide like you'd think it would be. In fact, the share of the braking force sent to each end is usually set slightly in favour of the front wheels, with some exceptions. However, you don't really need to know this. As a driver, all you need to be aware of is that the name for the split of braking force between front and rear is called brake bias, and that it actually plays a big part in how your car behaves when you brake. You don't need to know the details on how it works, just that it does. What makes brake bias such a powerful thing to know about is that almost all race cars in simulators give you the ability to adjust your brake bias whenever you want, as you're driving, from the cockpit. But not only is it something that you can change on the go, it's also often the only thing you can still change when you're in a fixed setup series on iRacing, where every setting on the car is locked except brake bias. Because of this, knowing how to control brake bias gives you a big advantage over those who don't. If this will be your first time exploring brake bias, you'll need to choose your controls for doing so in your game menu. In most simulators and games that feature it, you will need to choose two buttons to operate brake bias, one to increase it and one to decrease it. I personally use the two thumb buttons either side of my steering wheel, as I like to count my button presses clearly and have them split on opposite sides of the wheel, just like the shifter paddles are. But you can choose a dial to do this, whatever seems comfortable for you, just make sure you can get to it easily. It's also handy to be able to see the current brake bias percentage your car is set to, which you can usually bring up in game. In iRacing, you can see the brake bias by pressing F8 to bring up the in-car adjustments box, but some cars will show you the brake bias on the dashboard, and if you happen to have an external dash display, then you might be able to see it there as well. So what does brake bias do exactly? Well, generally speaking, increasing brake bias makes a car safer and more stable while braking, but makes it less eager to turn and increases your stopping distances. In other words, safer but slower. Decreasing brake bias makes a car more unstable and nervous while braking, but makes it more eager to turn and can also improve your stopping distances. In other words, looser and sketchier, but has the potential to be faster if you can control it. Brake bias is usually displayed as a percentage, and this is represented to you as a percentage of front bias, meaning if you see 52% brake bias, that means 52% is going to the front, leaving the remaining 48% going to the back. Therefore, if you increase the percentage, that means you're sending more brake force towards the front, and decreasing the percentage means moving it towards the rear. However, the percentage number itself is not what you should focus on. Don't be fooled into thinking that any percentage above 50% is safe just because more force is going to the front than the back. That's an easy mistake to make, and it doesn't work that way, not to mention other factors in the setup that make this a bit of a mirage. What really matters is the movement of a percentage one way or another. If you're driving open setup series, A car with high downforce and high grip may be able to tolerate a much lower, more aggressive brake bias setting. That same car at a different track with a low downforce setting may need much more brake bias, meaning a safer balance, because it doesn't have as much grip. This is why I say don't worry about what the percentage itself is, because it can vary wildly from car to car, setup to setup. All you need to worry about is whether you move that percentage up or down to change the balance when you brake. Like I said earlier, brake bias is like choosing the amount of milk in your tea. Use more milk when you need a safer, weaker cup of tea that won't offend anyone but is really boring. Or use less milk for a stronger, daring cuppa for when you want to taste it. You know, really live on the edge. Another important thing to keep in mind about brake bias is that it only affects how things feel when you're using the brakes. So it has no effect on anything at all if you're not pressing the brake pedal. Brake bias only influences how you enter corners, though how you enter corners influences how the rest of it goes, so that's no small thing. Okay, so let's look at practical examples of how brake bias can help you racing. And to start with, let's talk about using it to add safety and stability. Welcome to a segment I'm calling Vicious Corners that are made completely harmless when you add a bit of brake bias. A great example that comes to mind is Sunset Bend at Sebring Raceway, the last corner on the track. You enter it at top speed, it's really bumpy, and you have to slow down a lot for it whilst throwing the car into the turn. This corner is many racers' nightmare because it's very easy to lose the back end of the car on entry. So, if you find Sunset Bend really tricky to get around safely, increasing your brake bias to put more bias towards the front of the car will add stability and safety. It may come at a small cost to how well your car turns, it may feel a little less agile as a result, but the extra confidence you'll have with the car should pay for itself in terms of race pace and avoiding a crash. Another dicey corner is Pouhon at Spa. It's very fast, faces downhill, and in most cars requires a short but sharp slice on the brakes when swooping into it. Those factors can combine to make Pouhon quite tricky, as the back end can suddenly get loose on entry if you accidentally add too much of any one ingredient. Pouhon isn't too bad a corner in itself, it's merely the fact that it requires an accurate swipe of brakes and steering to nail it, and if you get that wrong you're in for a ride. Just like our first example, if you find this corner particularly tricky, increase your brake bias and you will find the car is much less nervous when you dip into that brake pedal. You'll find there to be a bigger margin of safety and this corner will scare you no more. There's a chance you may have to take it slightly slower to avoid running wide and picking up an off track or a track cut, but it will pay you back with added bravery and confidence. For our final example of corners designed to make your bum squeak, we're looking at turn 1 of Daytona Road Course. Here we have another very fast, off camber, slightly bumpy and ever tightening corner that requires you to brake hard whilst the car is turning, which is a recipe for a nervous car. If you find this corner feels a bit like Russian roulette, once again, just increase your brake bias a % or so and you will see the difference. You will have much more confidence entering the corner at a slight cost of turning power. In all 3 examples you just saw, the focus was on how adding brake bias can be useful to make the car more stable and build your confidence so that you can feel like you're making solid progress. Nothing comes for free though, and although you notice your car is more predictable under braking when you add brake bias, the ultimate absolute potential lap time you're capable of may suffer because it won't turn as well because the balance has become too safe. However, your lap times were only going to start coming down when you believe in your connection to the car, and that's always undermined if you're constantly worried about spinning. So don't feel bad about upping brake bias to make it safer if it works for you. I still need to do this from time to time when I just feel like things are getting a bit sketchy due to tyre wear, track heat or just lack of concentration. And by adding a dash of brake bias, I help protect against my own mistakes when I'm just not feeling on the ball. Brake bias is not just useful for adding stability to tame a nervous car under braking, it can also be turned the other way to reduce stability. Why would you ever want to reduce stability? Well, in reality, the words reduce stability just means make the car looser and easier to turn. This is a thing to understand about brake bias. It's about balancing speed against safety. And if you feel as though you have too much safety in the car, you can sacrifice some of it to unlock some pace. If you're going around a track and the car feels almost like it's too tight and you're missing the corner apexes due to understeer when braking, that's the sort of situation where you might decide to knock your brake bias down a bit to make the car relax and let the rear of the car float a little bit. In other words, introducing a dash of oversteer. When you reduce your brake bias a bit, you'll now notice your car will turn slightly harder when trial braking, and it may feel like it's cornering better, but at the same time you may feel that it's now slightly looser and less safe. The clip on screen is of me losing control of the car because I was running a lower, more aggressive brake bias setting to improve pace, which I was coping with for a time. However, my concentration lapsed for a moment, and with no safety net of stability that a higher brake bias setting would have given me, I lost it. If I was running more bias, this spin probably wouldn't have happened, but this is the trade-off you make by using brake bias to add agility. If you like to race fixed setup series in iRacing, you might discover that those setups are often built a little bit on the safe side in order to make sure everyone can actually drive them. What that means though is that sometimes you can crack a little extra cornering power and lap time out of them if you go more aggressive with your brake bias, provided you can control it. One specific situation where brake bias can be lowered to directly gain lap time is in deep braking zones, the type where you're braking hard in a straight line from 6th gear all the way down to 2nd or 1st. For this, think Monza Turn 1, the hairpin at Hockenheim, the hairpin at Sebring, basically any section of track where a high speed section ends with a hard braking zone into a tight chicane or even a hairpin. For these sections of track, if you reduce brake bias by 1% or 2 before you're due to hit your brake marker, you should find that your stopping distance improves slightly, which basically means you can brake that little bit later for it. This might only be by a car length or 2, but if you want to find an extra 10th or 2 in your lap times, this is one of the areas where it can be chipped loose with the help of brake bias. As well as improving your stopping distance, the more aggressive brake balance should also help your car rotate around the slow apex corner you now find yourself at, giving you a nice double dip of help. You'll just need to be a bit more careful not to end up in a slow speed spin when you do actually turn in. Smooth and delicate steering will still be needed whenever your brake bias is set aggressively. Then, once you're escaping from that part of a track, you can click the bias up again and return it to a more neutral balance for the rest of the lap. Sometimes brake bias can be useful for counteracting cold tyres at the start of a stint. On the opening laps of a race, some cars understeer, some cars oversteer. But in either case, you can take the sting out of whichever cold tyre quirk your car of choice has by adjusting your bias accordingly for the first lap or so. This is also worth doing sometimes because it adds a margin of safety and control if you have to brake hard to avoid contact with someone else. That extra dash of front brake bias could save you from losing control. Here's an example of me spinning out on lap 1 in a recent race, which was completely unforced and all down to me just pushing a little too hard at one of the trickiest braking zones on the track and getting completely caught out. I don't always add extra brake bias for the start of a race, but here's an example where I wish I had, because that might have prevented this spin. I could have run 1% more brake bias for laps 1 and 2, and then put it back down to normal once things have settled in. Keep it in mind, because although a safer brake bias setting might induce some understeer and slow you down a little bit, spinning will slow you down a lot. In cars that don't have ABS, including LMP cars, Formula and certain varieties of GT, brake bias takes on an even deeper meaning. Cars without ABS require more accuracy and restraint, in particular front tyre lockups are a real threat. But you can tilt the odds back in your favour by using brake bias to give yourself more room for error against whichever end of the car your problems lie. If you're always worried about locking the front tyres up, you need to reduce brake bias. If you're always worried about losing the rear of the car under braking, you need to increase brake bias. If you have different problems at different corners, you can always adjust brake bias partway through the lap. The tricky bit is just remembering to do that. So increasing or decreasing bias is the way to go to solve certain problems, but you'll also need a general idea of how much by. For me, the usual range of brake bias adjustment I need is up to maybe 2% either side of what comes in the setup by default. So for example, in our demo Mercedes GT3, there happens to be a standard bias setting of 54%. I don't usually have to stray outside of the 52 to 56% range to get the effect I want. Any more than that is unusual for me. If I was to use a different setup for the Mercedes and it came with 56% bias as standard, I would stick between 54 and 58%. It's just a rule of thumb to remember, as most cars give you the ability to adjust brake bias far outside of the ideal range, way beyond most reasonable settings. It's important to know that you only need to nudge your brake bias, rather than smashing it out of the ballpark. Alright, I said at the start of this video that brake bias was simple to understand. And it is. I'm just getting carried away with how many situations there are that brake bias can be of use to you. In reality, you can involve yourself into brake bias as little or as much as you can be bothered to do. Just knowing that you can use it is often enough for you to think of situations where it could have helped you if only you knew about it. It's easy to understand. In essence, increase bias to add safety and understeer when you need confidence, decrease bias to add agility and oversteer when you're in a zone. Adjust it anytime on track to find a happy balance that suits your style as often as you like. All that matters is that you now know you can adjust the behaviour of the car under braking and how to do it. It's so simple that you cannot pass it by. You're always wishing you were a better sim racer. Well, here's one of the easiest things you can do to take another step up. Thanks for watching. I hope this made sense, but if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to ask in the comments below, and please do chip in with any additional pointers I might have missed. Don't forget to give Race Anywhere a mosey, and remember the 5% discount code Danny Lee. Drop a like and subscribe for more stuff like this in the future. Cheers!